This is Ideas Worth Exploring by Mark MacDonald.
Welcome back to the second part of this series on climate change. Last time we talked about the science behind the greenhouse effect and why putting CO2 into the atmosphere can make your thermometer show larger numbers. In this episode, I want to talk about the effects of global warming will have on the world, and especially on human beings. Greenhouse gas emissions have already made the temperature go up by about 1 degree Celsius in the last 150 years or so, which doesn't sound like very much. But climate scientists project that with current policies and trends that are in place around the world, the average temperature will rise by another 1.7 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, which also doesn't sound like very much. Why are people so worried about such a small change in temperature? I've spent the last several weeks figuring out the answer to that question, and I was very surprised by some of the things I learned. I'm going to divide this analysis of the effects of global warming into 4 parts. The effects of warmer temperature itself, including blind octopuses, lonely turtles, and heat waves. Then, how warmer air can hold more water in it, which will cause droughts and floods and potentially make vegetables less nutritious. Then, how warmer temperatures melt ice, which will cause sinking islands and extinct rats. Then, the effects of global warming on storms, and also what kinds of storms are not affected. Then, a more specific focus on how it will affect humans. Finally, I'll end by putting climate change into context by comparing it with some other global crises. This isn't a comprehensive list of all possible climate consequences. These are just a couple of the most interesting ones I stumbled across in my reading, though I did do a lot of reading. As we go through these climate consequences, I'm going to talk about how it will affect a lot of different animals, but you might notice that I pay extra attention to the effects on humans. I hope you forgive me for that. It's just that humans are my favorite animal, and I really like them. Part 1. Temperature effects. First, let's talk about some things that will happen as a direct result of raising the temperature. I'll start with a few that deal with animals, which I mostly learned from one of my favorite YouTubers named Tierzoo. So here they are. Octopuses. Warm water makes octopus eggs develop faster, and it helps them grow to larger sizes. And as the oceans warm, it will let octopuses expand their territory and move into new waters that used to be too cold for them. So global warming might be the best thing that ever happened to the octopus. Or maybe not. Research that came out earlier this year showed that if the water is too warm, the octopus babies will go blind. Baby octopuses raised in warm water don't develop some of the essential proteins for their vision, which is rough when you're a creature that uses around 70% of your brain for visual processing. Also, other research has shown that warmer waters also make octopus eggs have a higher mortality rate. So warming ocean temperatures are probably bad for octopuses after all. Honestly, they'll probably just move until they get to water that's the right temperature, but it's fun to speculate about how global warming could be the key that prevents our future octopus overlords from taking over the world. Turtles. Turtles, like some other reptiles, have their gender determined by the temperature. If the eggs incubate at a cooler temperature, then they're born male, and if they incubate at a warmer temperature, they're born female. According to some research done in the last couple years, in parts of the Great Barrier Reef, 99% of newly hatched green sea turtles are being born female because of the high temperature. Those poor lonely sea turtle women. Luckily for them, male sea turtles are polygamous, and so maybe the ladies won't be all that lonely after all. Frogs. There's a fungal parasite with a name I can't pronounce that infects frogs and other amphibians and kills them. The range of this fungal parasite is getting bigger due to climate change, and this is making populations of frogs in some regions go extinct. Some conservation groups are actually building little houses that the frogs can go into to raise their body temperature, which can help their immune system fight off the fungus, which is really cute in a sort of fungus apocalypse sort of way. Ticks, mosquitoes, killer bees, and scorpions. Not all species will suffer from climate change. These stinging and biting insects thrive in warmer temperatures and will likely spread their range as it gets hotter. That means places that previously never had to worry about them will have new friends to enjoy. It also means that diseases will spread beyond their current ranges, but I'll say more about that later. Finally, humans. Climate change will make it so there are more heat waves and fewer cold waves. Right now, it looks like climate change is actually saving more lives from the cold than it's costing to heat. But this trend is expected to flip sometime in the next 50 years or so, when more lives will be lost to heat than saved from cold. Part 2. Water in the air. Hot air can hold more water. For every degree Celsius increase, the atmosphere can hold about 7% more moisture. And this will have a variety of effects, such as the following. Heavy rains and floods. If the air holds more water, that means that when it rises to higher altitudes and cools down, there will be more water to condense into clouds, making it rain harder. It won't necessarily rain more overall, but it will rain more intensely, more water in a shorter time, the kind of rain that causes flooding. It's really hard to get good data on floods, but we do have data to show that heavy rains are going up, and so scientists assume that this also means floods, which seems like a fair assumption. And when I say that heavy rains are going up, I really mean that they're coming down, out of the sky and onto your head. Droughts. It seems weird at first glance that global warming would cause both flooding and drought, but at second glance, it makes a lot of sense. Hotter temperatures make it so water evaporates faster, so it doesn't stick around as long on the ground. Plants can't suck water out of the air, they need it to be in the soil, so this can lead to thirsty plants. This increase in droughts is expected to cause more famines as well, especially in poor countries near the equator where food security is a big issue. Actually, there's an interesting trade-off in how global warming will affect the global food supply. For some types of crops, more CO2 in the atmosphere can increase crop yields, all else being equal, because the plant uses the CO2 in the air to grow bigger and faster. Also, in some regions, climate change will make the growing season longer, which could also increase crop yields. But these effects have to be balanced against two other effects: an increase in droughts and insects and fungi and other pests spreading their territory. Which one wins in this balancing act? The CO2 and increased growing seasons helping the plants to grow, or the droughts and the pests hindering them? It looks like in richer countries, which are mostly further away from the equator, crop yields will be slightly boosted, but in poorer tropical countries in Africa and Asia, where people are already struggling for food, crop yields will tend to go down. It's a take from the poor and give to the rich kind of deal. Also, climate change appears to be making our vegetables less nutritious. That thing I just mentioned about how more CO2 in the atmosphere helps plants grow bigger and faster? Well, that's not always a good thing. If the plants are taking in more carbon from the air, but the same amount of nutrients from the soil as before, then the nutrients will be diluted in the veggie. Scientists are working on biofortification, or breeding new crops that naturally have higher nutrient density to help solve this problem. Others are working on breeding new crops that are more resistant to drought. In my opinion, creating these new types of crops is one of the most promising things we're doing to adapt to climate change. And last of all, fire weather. When I first heard the term fire weather, I imagined weather so hot that it made flames rain down from the sky. But fire weather really just means hot, dry weather that makes it more likely for forest fires to start and spread. And forest fires do several things, but among them are fire and smoke. Smoke puts a bunch of things in the air that make it dangerous to breathe, potentially giving you asthma or lung cancer if you breathe in too much. And fire destroys trees and houses and occasionally historic monuments. And if you live in Arizona or California and like to have wild gender reveal parties that include pyrotechnics, fire weather will increase the chance that you will set the forest ablaze and be charged with up to 30 crimes. If I had a nickel for every time a gender reveal party caused a large forest fire in the last decade, I would have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Part 3. Melting ice. It turns out that ice melts when you heat it up, which in the US is expected to lower transportation costs. because there will be less ice and snow to remove from the roads. But warmer temperatures could also make ski resorts suffer. Apparently, when the snow isn't deep enough, ski resorts will force water and pressurized air through a snow cannon and shoot it out to produce artificial snow. So, as temperatures rise and ski seasons get shorter, resorts will either have to be open for less of the year or spend more money on artificial snow. Arctic sea ice is also melting. That's because it's summer in the northern hemisphere as I'm recording this, and Arctic sea ice melts in the summer and then grows back in the winter. But climate change is making it so that when this ice reaches its lowest point, it's smaller than it used to be, and climate models predict that sometime around 2050, there will be summers where the sea ice is all gone for a couple months of the year, which could be great for the shipping industry because it will mean there are new Arctic sea routes available for shipping. But it's not so great for the polar bears who live there. As the Arctic ice sheets shrink, it could make it so more oil reserves that were previously inaccessible become available, which is great for the oil and gas companies, though other aspects of global warming make drilling for oil more difficult. In Alaska, the permafrost is melting, and this is threatening to make the oil drilling machinery built on top of it unstable. But the oil drillers have a solution. They're building devices to cool the ground around their machinery to keep it solid so they can keep drilling. Even oil drillers are finding ways to adapt to a warming planet. Another consequence of melting ice is that it can make the sea level go up. Not the sea ice, that's already in the sea, but when glaciers on land in Greenland and Antarctica melt, they put water into the ocean that used to be on land, and this makes the water rise. But something I learned while studying for this episode was that melting ice only makes up about half of the sea level rise that's happening right now. There's another effect that's also making sea levels go up, and that is density. Have you ever filled up a water bottle all the way full and then left it in your hot car? You'll probably see that the water bottle starts to bulge, and if you open it, it might overflow. That's because water gets less dense if you heat it up. Hot water fills more space than cold water. So, as the oceans get warmer, the water in them also gets less dense. It expands, and this is the other reason sea levels are going up. But anyway, it's predicted that in the next 100 years, sea levels will rise by between 1 and 4 feet. Which doesn't sound like a lot, but it matters a lot for some people. On the island country of the Maldives, about 80% of the land area is less than 3 feet above sea level, so the people who live there are going to have it rough. And also, unlike most of the other effects of global warming, the sea level is going to keep going up for hundreds of years, even after we go carbon neutral. Finally, this seems like a good place to talk about species going extinct. The first mammal species to go extinct due to climate change was a little island rat sometime in the 2010s. It was called the Bramble Cay mellimus. It only lived on a single island near Australia, named Bramble Cay. Sea levels have already risen 6 to 8 inches in the last 100 years due to climate change, and apparently that was enough to erode the coast of Bramble Cay and get rid of much of the rat's habitat. And combined with some bad storms and flooding, that caused the little rat to go extinct. Which really makes me wonder, how much effort should we be putting into saving species like this? It's not the big cute animals that are going extinct, it's the rats that only live on a single island, and the rare rainforest toads, and weird snails and funguses and stuff. Maybe there are people who really care about weird snails and island rats, but I don't think I'm one of them. Though I will note that it's not just the animals going extinct who suffer from climate change. There are also some big, cute animals that are already endangered from poaching and deforestation and stuff that are getting an additional stress from climate change that they really don't need. Anyway, ice is melting, sea levels are rising, and at least one species of island rat has gone extinct. Let's keep going. Part 4. Weather. I've already talked about 4 big weather changes that are caused by climate change. To make it easier to remember them, imagine a thirsty, sweating camel with its hump on fire. It's a camel, so it's always hot. Global warming makes heat waves worse. The sweat represents flooding because water. It's thirsty because droughts, and the hump is on fire to represent fire weather. Why did I just make you picture a sweating camel on fire? Because those four weather events are the ones with the most solid evidence behind them. Most other extreme weather events, at the time I'm recording this in August 2024, just don't have evidence to say that climate change is making them worse. The IPCC report says that there's not enough data to claim any kind of trend in the intensity, frequency, or duration of thunderstorms, hailstorms, or tornadoes. Actually, that's not quite true. We already said that heavy rains are getting worse, and there's apparently some research saying that in the US, the number of days with tornadoes has gone down, but on days that do have tornadoes, there are more of them. Which is interesting if you're a tornado chaser, but doesn't really impact most people. The lack of evidence might mean that climate change isn't affecting these types of storms, or it might mean that we just don't have the data to show how it's affecting these types of storms. It would be nice to know how things like this with confidence, but that's not where we're at right now. It seems to me like if climate change was going to have a strong effect on these weather events, then we'd probably know it by now, but that's just my intuition. There is one more type of severe storm that you might be wondering about. Let's talk about hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons. These are three names for the same big, destructive, swirly air thing that sometimes happens over the ocean. People just use a different name depending on what part of the world it happens in. I'm going to use the word hurricane to refer to that type of swirling vortex of terror, because that's the word that gets used in my part of the world. Here's what we know about hurricanes. Since warmer air can hold more water, it's pretty well established that global warming will make it so hurricanes rain harder, and that probably means more flooding too. There's some evidence that the wind speed of hurricanes is getting slightly worse, but only between 1 and 10% worse in the next 100 years. However, climate change might also be making hurricanes less frequent. Actually, there isn't really a consensus on if the frequency of hurricanes is going down or not. You might even say it's still up in the air. So, hurricanes are getting slightly more destructive on average, but there might be fewer of them, though it's too early to say that with confidence. Now, I want to give some context for these extreme weather events. There is very solid data showing that property damages from every type of extreme weather event are increasing, and by a lot. But that's almost entirely because we keep building things, and there's now more property around to be damaged. And at the same time, the number of deaths and injuries from extreme weather events is plummeting. We're getting much better at handling natural disasters. The number of deaths per year from natural disasters has shrunk by a factor of 10 over the last 100 years, even as the world population has quadrupled in that time. That fact just amazes me. There are more people and more disasters than before, and yet we have 10 times fewer fatalities. Any number of deaths is still too many, but with our early warnings, evacuations, and better infrastructure, we're getting much better at handling the events that come our way. Part 5. Effects on people. Like I said earlier, humans are my favorite animal, and so I want to look specifically at how climate change is going to affect them. One source that I keep seeing cited says that it's estimated that climate change will cause the deaths of 250,000 people per year that wouldn't die otherwise, at least until 2050, which is not as many as I was expecting, given all the hype about climate change in the news. For context, car crashes kill 1.2 million people each year, about 5 times worse. But the real damage to humans from climate change isn't in the number of deaths. To see why, we need some concepts from a field that's been called the dismal science. That's right, I'm talking about economics. Economists like to differentiate between mortality, or people dying, and morbidity, which refers to illness and disease that makes your life worse but doesn't kill you. They have ways to compare the years of healthy life lost when people die in a flood to the years of healthy life lost from being malnourished as a child or from the mental health effects of living as a refugee. And with that comparison, you see that if you only look at the deaths, you're underestimating the total harm by a factor of 5. Most of the harm from climate change isn't from the deaths it causes, it's from sickness and malnourishment and mental health effects. But what specifically about climate change is causing these harms? There's a good report on this from the World Economic Forum, which I've linked in the description, and I thought it was very surprising. The two biggest ones are food insecurity and malaria, and the third big one is drinking salt water. The way economists compare mortality and morbidity on the same scale is by using something called disability adjusted life years, or DALYs, which I won't get into, but you can look up if you're interested. The two biggest costs of climate change in terms of DALYs are food insecurity and malaria. If we could cure malaria and get rid of food insecurity, we would solve 2/3 of the human welfare cost of climate change. First, food insecurity. We've already talked about this, but droughts and pests will make it so food is harder to grow in poorer countries near the equator, and this is expected to cause malnutrition, which will stunt the growth of millions of children in Africa and Asia. That is a huge problem, and while there is work being done to build irrigation infrastructure, spread farming techniques, and develop new crops that are more robust to drought, these initiatives need a lot more people and funding, both to develop new technology and to convince people to adopt it once it's ready. Second is malaria. When you think of climate change, malaria probably isn't the first issue that comes to mind, but according to the World Economic Forum, it's actually the second biggest cause of both mortality and morbidity from climate change. As temperatures go up and rain patterns change, mosquitoes are able to spread to new areas, and they'll bring with them diseases like malaria and dengue and Zika and chikungunya. And all of these are terrible, but malaria is the worst of the bunch. It's been claimed that out of all living organisms, the Plasmodium parasite that causes malaria has killed the most humans, even more than other humans have. Malaria is our ancestral enemy. We've been fighting it almost since the dawn of our species, and it's still among the most deadly of the preventable diseases, especially among children. Because malaria is preventable. There are programs to provide insecticide-treated bed nets to protect children from mosquitoes, anti-malarial pills to protect them from the parasite if they do get bitten, and in 2021, the first malaria vaccine was approved for widespread use. Then, as of last year, a second vaccine has been developed that's even more effective. Though that still doesn't mean the problem is even close to being solved, because these vaccines require multiple doses, and they need to be refrigerated, which makes it hard to deliver them to people in remote communities who need them the most. And all of these programs are severely underfunded, and climate change is only making the problem worse. The other diseases don't kill quite as many people as malaria, but they're still important, so let me say their names again. Dengue and Zika and chikungunya. I actually just wanted to say the word chikungunya again. Chikungunya. Okay, I'm done. Let's move on. The third biggest human cost of climate change is high blood pressure? Okay, I really didn't expect this one, but apparently as sea levels rise, it will make the water supply, even much further inland, get more salty. And drinking salty water tends to raise people's blood pressure. And so people throughout Africa and Asia especially are going to suffer from high blood pressure because of the sea level rising and making their drinking water slightly saltier. And according to the economists, this is the third biggest health risk of climate change. I never in a million years would have guessed. Those are the top harms to human well-being according to the economists. I'm not going to keep going down the list, but I do want to talk about a couple other things that might get overlooked. One is environmental refugees. As sea levels rise and displace people living near the coast or on islands, and as droughts and heat waves force people to move, there will be more and more environmental refugees. Most of these will be people moving within their own country, so it's not really going to be an immigration problem, but it could definitely cause political unrest. Another issue is mental health. The worst of it is in the refugees who lose their homes, or suffer from food insecurity and worry about starving, or the people who have their home flooded and lose all their belongings. And I don't want to downplay that at all, but I do want to mention another mental health issue that's more preventable, because it can be solved just by spreading awareness. I've seen quite a few people on the internet who are worried that climate change is going to make humans go extinct within the next couple decades, who are afraid to buy a house or have children because they think the world is going to go up in flames. According to the scientists who have studied it, there is basically zero chance that climate change will make humans go extinct in the next century. It's good that people are thinking about it and trying to make a difference, but there's no reason to worry about humans going extinct. From climate change, that is. There are things that might make humans go extinct. I talk about some of them in the episode A Brief History of Life, the Universe, and Everything, and climate change isn't even in the top 3. So, in summary, climate change is causing serious health consequences worldwide, and the ones that are most damaging aren't always the ones you'd expect. I focused on health consequences and mostly skipped the economic consequences. Those are also big and also important. I just didn't spend a lot of time looking into them. But even though climate change is going to be bad, there's hope. I mentioned earlier that even as natural disasters are getting worse, the total number of deaths from natural disasters is going down. Humans are very good at adapting, and as time goes on, more and more people are escaping extreme poverty, which also makes them more capable of handling big changes such as global warming. And new technologies are being invented every day to help us reduce our fossil fuel emissions and grow more drought-resistant crops and do all sorts of other things that will help people adapt. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about some of these innovations, but for now, I just have one more thing to talk about before being done. Part 6. Putting climate change in context. It's true that climate change will have big consequences for many different animals, and it will cause a lot of people grief and misery as well. But I feel the need to give some context for how climate change compares to 2 other types of global disasters, COVID-19 and air pollution. First, COVID. From the numbers I looked at, the deaths from climate change from now until 2050 are projected to be roughly double the deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic. Or if you're an economic snob like me, you'll look at DALYs, where climate change through 2050 will be about 5 times worse than COVID was. Which is still roughly comparable, though the climate change one was probably a conservative estimate, but it's spread out over more years, but also it's going to get worse over the years until we stop emitting CO2. My opinion on this? If we could focus some of our scientists and fundings on preventing the next pandemic, that would be great. There aren't nearly enough people working on that problem. Climate change already has a lot of people and funding being thrown at it. It's not really a neglected problem. More people and money would still help, but we can make the biggest gains by focusing our efforts on where they're needed most. Right now it seems like everyone is focused on getting rid of CO2 emissions, which definitely needs to happen. But that focus might make us neglect some of the really promising efforts to adapt to the reality of a changing climate. Efforts like creating more robust crops and protecting people from malaria. Focusing all our attention on getting to net zero carbon emissions more quickly and neglecting the adaptation strategies that will make the biggest difference would be a big mistake. Second comparison, air pollution. While climate change is a good enough reason to stop consuming fossil fuels, there's another, equally important reason to do it that doesn't get talked about as much, and that's air pollution. I mentioned earlier that an estimated 250,000 people are dying each year who wouldn't have died if it weren't for climate change, at least in the near future. Well, the World Health Organization estimates that the number of people who die from air pollution every year is over 7 million. A chunk of that is from people burning wood in indoor stoves without good ventilation, but more than half of the deaths are from burning fossil fuels. The World Health Organization also says that 99% of people breathe air that exceeds their recommended pollution limits. Learning about what a huge problem air pollution is convinced me to order a new air quality sensor, and it looks like my apartment is in the 1% of places that are within recommended limits, so that's nice. I'm actually pretty upset that I didn't know that air pollution was such a big issue, and now I want to learn more about it. Maybe I'll make a future episode on air pollution. Luckily, a lot of the efforts to push towards renewable energy for climate change purposes also help solve the air pollution issue. But in the next episode, when I talk about what we're doing to fight climate change, I'm going to make sure to keep in mind that things that reduce fossil fuel emissions serve double duty and also reduce air pollution, while other interventions like carbon capture don't have these extra benefits. Finally, the last thing to keep in mind is that deaths from climate change will keep going up if we lose steam on our climate initiatives. So even if air pollution is a worse problem now, climate change might overtake it eventually, and so it's important to look to the future. Conclusion. We've talked about many different aspects of the climate change problem today. There are pros and cons to having warmer temperatures. I mentioned that climate change is currently saving lives from cold spells and lowering transportation costs and other things like that. So, could you argue that climate change is actually a good thing? No, not if you're honest. When you add up the good and the bad, it's clear that the bad wins out by a long shot. Any numbers I've given in this episode generally assume that climate policies that are currently in place will continue as is. If our climate policies get more effective, or if we have unexpected technological breakthroughs, things will be much better. But if it looks like climate change is getting fixed and we stop giving it as much attention, then maybe we'll be more lax on our climate policies and things could be worse than this. Sometimes you'll hear people say that climate change is an existential threat to humanity. And sometimes they really believe that climate change is going to kill all the humans, though if they do, they're mistaken. But there is another way that climate change is an existential threat, and that it threatens the way of life of millions of people around the world. The Inuit people who live near the Arctic will have their way of life threatened as the ice goes away for more of the year. Other cultures will have their homeland flooded, especially people who live on low-lying islands. And climate change really is an existential threat to certain island rats and rainforest toads and probably some cute frogs too, and also green sea turtle gender equality in the Great Barrier Reef. I personally wouldn't say that climate change is an existential threat. I think saying it that way is misleading if you don't go on to explain what you mean. But if you add the context that it threatens the existence of certain peoples and cultures and animal species, then there is a sense in which it's true. Climate change is hard because it's change, and change is stressful and sometimes deadly. People and animals will adapt, but it'll be hard, and it would be better if we didn't have to, which is why the next episode will be about different strategies that are being developed to help fight climate change, and also look at the things individuals can do and how effective they are. A sneak peek. The following methods have been proposed to help solve climate change: resurrecting the mammoths, putting salt on our trash, feeding seaweed and garlic to cows, turning poop into jet fuel, and covering Antarctica in glass. Not to say that all of those are good ideas, but they sure are interesting. I hope you enjoyed this discussion of climate change. Come back next time for more science. Peace.
This has been Ideas Worth Exploring by Mark McDonald.